Hey, this is Ren Smith. So, every day on our local news and various screens, we see something we've come to take for granted: a weather map. For over 100 years now, part of the way we've drawn that map is with an instrument that seems downright whimsical: the weather balloon. Reportedly invented in 1892 France, the original balloons were huge, these monsters, thousands of cubic feet. They measured barometric pressure. Today, they're a lot smaller and gather varieties of weather-related data. Even with all our technological advancements, we're still dependent on floating these objects about twice a day. But recently, there have been some questions about whether that's still happening. That's particularly relevant now as hurricanes and other storms spin in the Atlantic. Hopefully, as the models predict, they'll continue to move away from coastal North Carolina. But how accurate are those models currently? We talked to someone who could help us figure that out. Welcome to Storm Stories, a Shoresides podcast where we tell stories about coastal North Carolina.
My name is Albert Friday. I go by Joe Friday. I spent quite a bit of time as Deputy Director and Director of the National Weather Service. Been a meteorologist my entire career, 20 years in the Air Force and then 19 years with the National Weather Service, both as Deputy and as Director of the National Weather Service. After that, I went to the National Academy of Sciences as a head of the Board on Atmospheric Sciences and Climate for 5 years, and then to the University of Oklahoma as a professor of meteorology for 5 years. And then I retired.
When Joe looked at the weather map recently, he saw two stories. One was in the middle of the country, the other was happening out in the Atlantic.
The major thing that's going on in the country as far as weather right now is a remarkably dry area across the middle part of the country, mild and dry. And then, of course, on the East Coast, we had the scare with the two hurricanes that were potentially going to interact with the East Coast.
There was some danger.
But fortunately, Humberto got strong enough that it pulled the other hurricane away from the coast. And although we've got quite a bit of active weather along the coast with respect to rain and wave action, we don't have the major hurricane threat that we would have had otherwise. And I'm glad of that for the National Weather Service, because the men and women of the National Weather Service are stretched pretty thin right now, and they were very concerned about being able to take care of major problems along any part of the country with the current staffing levels that they have.
That staffing crisis leads us directly back to those weather balloons.
One of the things that you have to understand if you're going to forecast the weather is you have to understand what's going on now. There's a lot of ways of doing that. Obviously, you can look out the window and observe the clouds and feel the temperature and the wind, but we have instruments to do that. Those instruments are located at the ground level. And if you're going to forecast using computer models what's going on the entire atmosphere, you need to be able to go and sample that atmosphere, not just at the surface, but also at upper levels of the atmosphere. And we've been using weather balloons for doing that for the last 100 plus years. We have about 100 locations across the United States where we launch weather balloons twice a day. This is coordinated with all of the world meteorological services so that those weather balloons are all launched at the same time to provide the upper air information to go into our various computer models.
So we asked him, why are the balloons so necessary?
It gives you information on wind and temperature and moisture. And those are particularly important ingredients when you're forecasting the development of weather events, the development of storms in the past. We have in NOAA, as a part of the National Weather Service, the Environmental Prediction Center, which consists of a major computer complex. The center itself is located in Maryland. And we run a very sophisticated computer model to predict what will happen. The Europeans have put together a consortium of about 13 or 14 European countries to pull their best scientists together to do the same sort of thing. Unfortunately, for quite some time, they have been better funded in that European consortium than we have in the National Weather Service. As a result of that, they've had a larger computer and a larger number of scientists able to work on the problem that we have. And even though our models are very close to each other, theirs usually have a slight advantage.
Then something changed. Recently, the accuracy of both models, the European and the American, started to slip.
In the last few months, since the National Weather Service has not been able to launch all of those weather balloons twice a day as they had before because of staffing shortages, we've seen both the accuracy of the European model and the accuracy of the United States model deteriorate. Not a lot, but you start to see the deterioration. And that deterioration can be the difference of forecasting the storm development and strength of the storm and exactly where it might go in the period of time 4 to 6 days from now, which is very important, particularly for the emergency management community, to be prepared ahead of time when a major storm might be headed their way.
When one part of the network fails, the whole picture gets fuzzier for everyone.
Because they depend on the United States weather balloons just the same way we depend on the European weather balloons as input into our computer models. Every meteorological service in the world depends on those weather balloons if they run a computer model. And even if they don't, they may be using someone else's computer models. Like you might be using the United States computer model. We share that information, for example, with other countries. Or they might be using the European computer model. So even if they're not running their own, they're going to be affected by the missing weather balloons that we can no longer launch. Now, we're supposed to be hiring people back now. We've been given authority in the National Weather Service to hire 450 or so additional employees to fill the vacancies that occurred at the beginning of the administration. But you just can't do that overnight.
Joe thinks that may have led to some consequences, like a recent Texas flood.
So it's taken a lot to try to recover from that. We saw the situation in Texas with the loss of life in the floods on the Guadalupe River. The forecast office did a great job of forecasting that flood with plenty of warning, but the coordination meteorologist had left during the early out program that DOGE offered, and the new person was there, but quite frankly didn't have the connections with the emergency managers that the experienced person had. And I'm not saying that caused the deaths, but it certainly contributed to the lack of fast response to an emergency situation. And that's the tragedy of what happens when somebody doesn't really understand the ecology of what goes on in a working environment in a weather service offices. All of these things tie together. You can't just go in and say, okay, you guys all leave, and hope to have a functioning organization as a result. Now, the men and women in the Weather Service are devoted to their work. They will do everything they can to do the best possible job, to get those weather warnings out, to get that emergency information out. Many of them now are working much more than a regular week. They're working overtime. You can only stretch the rubber band so tight before it breaks. You can only expect that workforce to do the overtime and still be as sharp as they were for only a very limited period of time. I have a personal experience that kind of illustrates that. I was the last U.S. weatherman in Vietnam for the U.S. Air Force. I was in the Air Force at the time. And we worked 12-hour shifts in Vietnam. 12 hours on, 12 hours off. And I remember very, very vividly those first 8 hours, you were pretty sharp if you knew what was going on and all that. Hours 9 and 10, things were getting a little tired. By the time 11 and 12 rolled around, you weren't sure what you were seeing sometimes on those weather maps. It was very, very strenuous to work for extended periods of time on a job that requires attention to detail. And forecasting severe weather requires tremendous attention to detail.
Exhausted scientists, fewer weather balloons. It's a bad combination.
We have seen increases in error as a result of losing those balloons. But it's very, very difficult to say the loss of one balloon causes an error in the forecast position of a hurricane by 20 miles. But it will cause a loss. And that 20 miles might make a difference in some particular storm. And so there's no way of knowing, again, specifically on that, there's no way of attributing a specific action to the loss of one balloon. But the collective loss of those balloons is showing up with a loss in accuracy of the wind forecast by the numerical models to show where storms are moving and how they're developing.
Still, Joe is convinced the NWS will bounce back and that people will realize what a bargain it is.
I mean, I've been fortunate in enjoying every job I've ever had, but the Weather Service is an organization that does its damnedest to do the best possible job it can to serve the people of this country. And it's cheap. The cost of weather service and the weather satellites and all of that is less than the cost of a Big Mac and a Coke to every man, woman, and child for a year's worth of service. And that's not a Big Mac and a Coke every day. That's a single Big Mac and a Coke. When you compute the cost of the weather service.
When the next storm forms, we'll be hoping the map is clear. I'm Ren Smith, and this is Shoreside Storm Stories. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks to Joe Friday. Learn more about Shoresides at shoresides.org.